I am lucky enough that over the years I've got to share a stage with some wonderful scientists, you know, Dr. or Lord Robert Winston and Paul Howard-Jones. I don't know if you know him, and he's a UK neuroscientist, quite a popular one. He's appeared on quite a lot of TV programs. And when I heard him talk in this way about learning, so we're putting play for just a second to one side and just thinking in general about learning. And here's what he says, and it's in this great book, actually, if any of you are interested in following this through. He highlights the fact that there are 3 key processes in the brain involved in learning, according to neuroscience. The brain needs engagement. It needs knowledge. Now, where does that knowledge come from? In England at the moment, there's a very clear steer that knowledge only comes from adults that teach children. Well, we of course know that's poppycock. Of course, a lot of knowledge comes from other adults, but we know that children, learners, they're constantly constructing their own knowledge. Who ever told a young child not to put a sphere at the bottom of a tower? They learn, they figure it out. But of course, they are also observing others around them, their peers, their parents, other adults, the TV. So there's various ways in which we are gaining our knowledge. We also need, and this is learners of any age, including us, we need the chance to consolidate that knowledge, you know, to really get those networks strongly embedded in our brain. We need to practice it. Now, this isn't a 3-part lesson plan. It's not that you need engagement, then when that's done, you can go on to the knowledge part. These processes need to be happening together. And I think that if I think especially about the English national curriculum right now, it's all about the building of knowledge and maybe the consolidation. But there's a view that consolidation needs to be done, that repetition must be in a very adult directed way. And actually, as I think I'm going to highlight here, it's probably one of the least effective ways. The engagement often gets lost. So what we're really talking about here is, what do we want children to get better at, our learners to get better at, and what do they love? What engages them? Now, if we had longer, we could spend a lot of time sticking in the chat what engages children, learners of any age. And if you want to, do go ahead and do that while I carry on talking. What engages them? Well, and why is it? But I want to go back before we think about that to thinking, why is this engagement so key to learning? So if you don't mind moving on there, Becky. I think we know that, but sometimes it's really handy to have it embedded for us. If we go to and think about the brain, our brains have evolved to pay attention to experiences that may be novel in some way or that we find rewarding. And this straight away links us to engagement and why it's so key for learning. We need to be engaged in what it is we're learning. And core to this, if you move on for me, Becky, is our dopamine system. Now, dopamine, you'll know that is kind of the brain's reward system. You know, it's the thing that controls pleasure in the brain, but also memory. Now, we often think about dopamine for negative reasons, you know, that we have something and we want more of it, like Class A drugs. Not me. Alcohol, chocolate. You know, we often think around dopamine as being things that aren't so good for us. But we also know we get those dopamine hits around great things like physical exercise, cold swimming for me. But dopamine, because of this really vital role it plays in terms of memory as well as pleasure, it's absolutely key for learning. So recent studies, for example, have shown that dopamine, it doesn't just create excitement in your brain, it actually helps to control learning retention. And what we now are finding out from studies is that when that dopamine isn't really present in the learning process, a person's performance will suffer due to that lack of drive, lack of motivation. Those of you familiar with the work of Csikszentmihalyi, when he talks about flow, and when we're really at that kind of core state, when we're deeply engaged in something, that's usually something where we're pushing ourselves, but in a voluntary focus on something that we are really challenged by. And I think the voluntary element of that is key. And you can see where I'm leading here, right? Secondly, because dopamine is linked to memory, it triggers the brain to remember the things that are being practiced, learned during then. So if we really want to translate this, dopamine equals engagement and retention, making learning memorable. Now, if you're working as a teacher, you know, we're not neuroscientists. You don't have to spend ages thinking about how I can activate dopamine in my students. You simply have to think about what engages young people, what engages children. And we know there are many things that do that. Some of you may have put some things in the chat, but what we can't deny is that play is one of the most naturally engaging experiences that children and students can be involved in, and adults, I firmly believe. I think this is a really interesting piece of research that came out from Emory University in Atlanta, really particularly linked to our amygdala, that if we have an emotional experience of some kind, the amygdala seems to tag that memory in a way that it's better remembered. Now, obviously, this can be negative emotional experiences. We hang on to those negative emotional experiences, even if they happened when we were young babies and we can't actively remember them. We know we hold on to them, but also in terms of really positive things. And, you know, a little thought experiment, I suppose, here. If I ask you all right now to think back to your first ever maths test at high school, what do you remember about that? And I'm going to guess that unless it was you did amazingly well and felt brilliant, or unless you did terror, Siobhan is saying, you might remember it then, because that was an emotional experience, a highly emotional experience. So those of you that are remembering lots, it's about because it was a negative emotion. Obviously, we don't want children to link their schooling and education to negative experiences. Unfortunately, as an aside, as someone that has a 15-year-old autistic ADHD daughter who has not been able to really receive any secondary education because it is so stressful, I'm on a particular personal mission to change the face of secondary education so that the emotional memories are positive. So most of you can't remember your first maths test, or if you did, it was because it was negative. Now, if I ask you to think back and remember your first kiss, I kept it clean. If you try and remember your first kiss, which may have been around the same time, don't give me details, but I bet most of you will remember that. Why? Because it mattered. Because something in your brain said, this matters in some way. So if we want children to retain and to remember things, we need to give them an emotional experience that is positive. It's a no-brainer, if you'll excuse the pun. There's also lots of research around myelin coating and that being thicker and stronger in the brain when there's been a high engagement, you know, an emotional experience, experiential learning, agency in learning. All of these things we know play gives us. So if we just move on to looking at an example of how play can change the face of learning for children. Over here in England, when children go into year one, when they're still 5, they go straight into the national curriculum, and it is very heavy, it's very knowledge-led, and it's really quite challenging to work with and to make it playful. But people do. In this class, they were learning about materials in this year 1 class, okay? And no being negative about the practitioner here, because this practitioner was an NQT, just following on what went before. So their writing for this week around materials had the following learning objectives, okay? This adult wants can you move on for me there, Becky? This adult wants the children to obviously practice using adjectives. So this is their criteria. These are their objectives for year 1. It's basically describe properties of wood. Now, quickly, all of you, describe properties of wood in the chat, please. I mean, I've literally come up with brown and woody. I can't think when in the rest of your life you're probably going to need, well done, you're doing better than me. You're probably going to need to be able to describe the properties of wood unless you're going to be a carpenter. I definitely can't think of where the engagement might be in this for a 6-year-old, or even probably for an 11-year-old, definitely not for a 52-year-old here. Of course, as we know, when children, as we've already heard, when children aren't deeply engaged, when they're not motivated, the learning can be minimal. And that's exactly what was happening. The children were writing in their books. It was very little. They were getting some of their expanded noun phrases in, but they weren't being driven. That same adult then, when she took on a much more play-based approach to learning, as well as direct teaching, if you move on for me there, Becky, moved on to free play, a cafe. And she was now trying to really think about how can we make this stuff matter to children? And this is just one example of what came out. She thought, what do children love? They love playing games still. They love being involved in writing for a purpose. So here the children had a cafe, they were setting it up themselves, but they had to make some menus and things to go with it while they were serving people. And they got to use the computer. Whoa, as if children never get to use a computer, but because they could use it as part of their play, they loved designing these menus. This menu on the left is by the same child that you saw in the previous picture. If you just go back, Becky. Can you go back one? This is the child who was writing about the descriptive properties of wood. And I took a sneaky photograph. It says it all. It doesn't matter. When we look at the next one, he's playing. He's really happy to be writing about the menus because it matters. It's making his play better. He then chose to go on to decide it would be really good if they had evaluation forms to give out. So when they'd finished serving people in the cafe, they had to fill in these evaluation forms. And so we're just seeing in this one example, the difference in the impact for motivation, but also the impact for outcomes. I don't think any of us have a problem with thinking about the importance of play for well-being, for mental health, for social skills, for 21st century skills, for learning behaviors. But too many people don't believe that play improves learning and raises outcomes. And I can tell you absolutely clearly from the years and years that I worked in a very challenging area, Lewisham in Southeast London, where children don't come in with high outcomes. Those children left, and it was the early years at that time, they left the early years consistently achieving the highest outcomes in the country. It was where children at risk of educational disadvantage consistently achieved the highest outcomes in the country for many, many, many years. Why? Simply because teachers were teaching children the way they learn best, with play as a core feature. So just to summarize there, I'm not sure, I forgot to press my timer, Becky, so I hope I'm on time. We talk a lot in Press Play about defining play. We talk about the difference between play and what we've termed playful learning, really, that play really has to come from the child. You might provide the resources, or the child might, but they're in control of their own exploration and play. And this can happen and should happen right the way through for periods of time at least. And we've got some wonderful schools like King's School in Bangkok, for example, that are doing this right the way through the school. You know, they're putting 2 hours, they're starting with small steps, 2 hours of completely free school, free play, right the way up into the end, end of key stage 2 as well, and hoping to build that. In play, the adult's role is responsive, not to take over, but to enhance where necessary. But the key thing about play is that you can't have preset outcomes, and that upsets a lot of people. You'll have a million outcomes that come out of it, but they're improvisational. You'll see them happening, and it's your job as an adult to notice them happening. Or you might join the child and add that something extra that just moves their thinking on. In playful learning, when it's more adult-led or adult-initiated, the teaching will perhaps be more intentional. You will have curricular goals you're aiming towards. And the reason we call this playful learning is that it isn't like describing the properties of wood for no reason. It's experiential, it's engaging, it's empowering, it's enjoyable. And I firmly believe there should be no learning that happens in early years, in primary or secondary, that isn't play or playful learning. Because if we're giving children learning opportunities that aren't engaging, empowering, and enjoyable, then really, folks, what are we here for? I think that's me done now.